If you walk through Moscow today, you will see the monuments of a vanished empire. You will see the towering spires of Stalinist skyscrapers, built to announce a superpower's arrival. You will see the Moscow metro with its chandeliers and marble halls designed to look like palaces for the proletariat. You will see Red Square, where military parades once displayed an arsenal that terrified the Western world. In 1985, the Soviet Union was not just a country. It was a colossus. It was an empire spanning 11 time zones, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It was a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying civilization. It was the ideological rival that had contested American dominance for 4 decades. Western intelligence agencies calculated Soviet military spending at levels that matched or exceeded American budgets. The CIA estimated that the Soviet economy was the second largest on Earth. The Kremlin's official statistics claimed annual growth rates that put the capitalist West to shame. But they forgot one critical thing. They forgot that numbers on paper are not the same as bread on the table. They did not realize that an empire can drown in its own lies. This is the story of the greatest economic illusion in modern history. It is the story of how a superpower that claimed to have conquered the contradictions of capitalism was, in fact, bleeding to death from wounds it refused to acknowledge. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lost a war. It did not collapse because of a revolution. It collapsed because the numbers were fake, the system was broken, and the bill finally came due. This is not a story about ideology. It is a story about arithmetic. It is the story of how an empire built on the promise of scientific economic planning became the largest bankruptcy the world has ever seen. To understand how the Soviet Union bankrupted itself while claiming to be rich, we must go back to the fundamental architecture of the planned economy. In 1928, Joseph Stalin launched the first 5-year plan. The goal was to transform a backward agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse through central planning. The state would own all means of production. The state would set all prices. The state would determine what was made, how much was made, and where it was sent. The market, with all its chaos and inequality, would be abolished. In its place would stand a rational system where scientists and engineers would calculate the optimal allocation of resources. On paper, it worked miracles. The official statistics showed steel production increasing by 400%. Coal output tripled. New cities rose from the Siberian wilderness. The Soviet Union went from producing almost no tractors to becoming one of the world's largest manufacturers. When the Great Depression crushed the capitalist economies in the 1930s, Soviet propagandists pointed to their growth figures as proof that history was on their side. But beneath this impressive surface, something was rotting. The problem was not the ambition. The problem was the information. A market economy uses prices to coordinate millions of decisions. When steel becomes scarce, its price rises, signaling producers to make more and consumers to use less. This happens automatically without any central authority. But in the Soviet system, prices were set by bureaucrats in Moscow. They had no real information about scarcity or demand. They were guessing, and they were guessing wrong. The Soviet system created what economists would later call soft budget constraints. If a factory failed to meet its targets, it was not allowed to fail. The state would simply provide more resources. If a collective farm produced rotten wheat, the state would still buy it at the official price. There was no bankruptcy, no consequence for inefficiency. This meant that waste became institutionalized. Resources poured into black holes and never emerged. Gosplan, the state planning committee, was the brain of the Soviet economy. It employed thousands of economists and statisticians who attempted to coordinate the activities of hundreds of thousands of enterprises. They issued production targets, allocated raw materials, and set prices for millions of products. But the task was mathematically impossible. The number of calculations required to optimally coordinate a modern economy exceeds the computational capacity of any bureaucracy. Gosplan didn't plan the economy. It improvised constantly, desperately, and badly. The critical flaw was the incentive structure. Factory managers were rewarded for meeting quotas, not for efficiency or quality. If a shoe factory's quota was measured in pairs, it would produce millions of tiny children's shoes because they were cheaper and faster to make. If a nail factory's quota was measured in tons, it would produce gigantic, useless nails. If a glass factory's quota was measured in square meters, it would produce glass so thin it shattered on delivery. The system optimized for appearances, not reality. By the 1960s, Soviet leaders knew the system was sick. Premier Alexei Kosygin attempted reforms in 1965, trying to introduce profit as a measure of success. But the reforms threatened the power of the bureaucracy, and they were quietly strangled. The patient was diagnosed, but no one was willing to perform the surgery. The Soviet Union discovered its magic trick in 1965 in the frozen wilderness of western Siberia. Geologists drilling near the Ob River struck oil. Not just any oil, but vast reservoirs that would prove to be among the largest deposits on Earth. The Samotler field alone contained billions of barrels. Within a decade, the Soviet Union became the world's largest oil producer. Crude petroleum, the black blood of industrial civilization, gushed from Siberian wells and flowed through pipelines to customers in Western Europe. The timing was providential. In October 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent global petroleum prices skyrocketing. The price of a barrel of oil quadrupled almost overnight. The Soviet Union, sitting on oceans of crude, was suddenly swimming in hard currency. Dollars and Deutschmarks poured into the Kremlin's coffers. The Soviet leadership had discovered that they could purchase Western technology, Western grain, and Western consumer goods without fixing their broken domestic economy. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev had stumbled into a fortune. With this windfall, they could have reformed. They could have invested in modernizing their decrepit factories. They could have shifted their economy toward efficiency. Instead, they did the opposite. The oil money became a substitute for reform. It was a painkiller that masked the Soviet leadership embarked on a spending spree. They poured resources into the military-industrial complex, building nuclear submarines, intercontinental missiles, and tank divisions on a scale that dwarfed even American efforts. They maintained a vast empire of client states, subsidizing Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, and dozens of other communist movements. They attempted to match the United States weapon for weapon, ship for ship, satellite for satellite. The defense burden crushed the civilian economy. Western analysts estimated that the Soviet Union spent between 15 and 25% of its gross national product on defense. The true figure may have been even higher, hidden in the murky categories of the Soviet budget. In the United States, the comparable figure was around 6%. The Soviet citizen was paying 3 or 4 times as much of their labor for guns instead of butter. By the late 1970s, the Soviet economy had become a Ponzi scheme of commodities. They exported oil and gas to earn hard currency. They used the hard currency to import grain because their collective farms could not feed the population. They used the hard currency to import technology because their factories could not innovate. They used the hard currency to maintain their military because their ideology demanded parity with the capitalist enemy. Think about the implications of that structure. The Soviet Union, which claimed to represent the future of humanity, could not feed itself. It could not clothe itself properly. It could not manufacture a decent automobile or a reliable television. The second superpower on Earth was dependent on selling raw materials to buy the products of capitalist industry. In 1979, 2 events accelerated the trajectory toward disaster. On Christmas Day, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. The Kremlin believed it would be a brief intervention to stabilize a friendly government. Instead, it became a decade-long quagmire. The Afghan war devoured resources at a rate of roughly 3 to 4 billion rubles per year. It killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers. It demoralized the military and shocked a population that had been told the Red Army was invincible. Afghanistan was the Soviet Vietnam, a wound that would not stop bleeding. At the same moment, a different kind of time bomb was being assembled in the oil markets. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution and the subsequent Iran-Iraq War sent oil prices to historic highs. The price of crude reached $35 per barrel, equivalent to over $100 in today's money. Soviet hard currency revenues soared, but the bonanza bred complacency. Rather than treating the windfall as temporary, Soviet planners assumed the good times would last forever. They increased their spending commitments based on optimistic projections. They borrowed from Western banks against future oil revenues. It was financial suicide in slow motion. The warning signs were everywhere for anyone willing to look. Productivity growth had collapsed. The gap between Soviet and Western living standards was widening, not narrowing. Infant mortality, which should decline in any healthy society, was actually increasing in the Soviet Union during the 1970s. The statistics were so embarrassing that the government stopped publishing them. The agricultural system was a catastrophe. Despite having more arable land than almost any nation on Earth, the Soviet Union was the world's largest importer of grain. Collective farms squandered resources on an industrial scale. Tractors rusted in fields because there were no spare parts. Crops rotted in warehouses because the transportation system could not move them to cities before they spoiled. Soviet citizens spent hours each day standing in lines for basic goods. But the Politburo, the ruling council of old men in Moscow, could not bring themselves to act. Brezhnev was senile, kept alive by doctors but incapable of governing. When he died in 1982, he was replaced by Yuri Andropov, who died in 1984, who was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who died in 1985. The gerontocracy was literally dying, but it refused to change. They were riding a tiger and could not dismount. The system was producing lies instead of goods. Factory managers reported fake production figures to meet their quotas. Regional bosses reported fake statistics to please Moscow. Moscow reported fake data to the world to maintain the image of socialist success. The entire economy was built on a foundation of falsified numbers. No one at the top had accurate information about what was actually happening below. The tipping point arrived in 1985, from two directions simultaneously. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. At 54, he was by far the youngest leader in Soviet history. He was energetic, reform-minded, and horrified by what he discovered when he examined the real books. Gorbachev later admitted that even he, a member of the Politburo, had not understood how bad things truly were until he took power. The economic data presented to the leadership had been systematically falsified for decades. The actual growth rate was not the 4 or 5% claimed in official statistics. It was closer to zero. In some years, it may have been negative. The Soviet Union was not catching up to the West. It was falling further behind every single year. But the external shock came from a direction no one in Moscow anticipated. In August 1985, Saudi Arabia opened the taps. Tired of losing market share to other producers, the kingdom abandoned its policy of restricting output to support prices. Saudi production surged from 2 million barrels per day to nearly 5 million. The global oil market, already softening, went into freefall. The price of crude petroleum collapsed from over $30 per barrel in 1985 to under $10 by 1986. Think about that figure. The commodity that funded the Soviet Empire lost 2/3 of its value in a single year. The impact on the Soviet budget was catastrophic. Every dollar decline in the oil price cost the Soviet government roughly $1 billion in annual hard currency revenue. A $20 decline meant $20 billion vanished from the treasury. The Kremlin was suddenly unable to pay for the imports that kept the system functioning. At the exact same moment, a second disaster struck. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The resulting fire released radioactive contamination across Europe. It was the worst nuclear accident in history, and it became a symbol of everything wrong with the Soviet system. The Chernobyl disaster was not simply a technical failure. It was a systemic failure. The reactor design was flawed, but Soviet engineers had been pressured to approve it anyway. The operators made errors, but they had been inadequately trained. The evacuation was delayed because local officials were afraid to report bad news to Moscow. The government lied to its own citizens and to the world about the severity of the contamination. The cleanup cost was staggering. Estimates range from hundreds of billions to over $700 billion when including long-term health effects and lost economic output. It was money the Soviet government did not have. The resources that might have been invested in economic reform were instead poured into containing a radioactive wound. In November 1986, Gorbachev looked at the ledgers and realized the game was up. The foreign currency reserves were drained. The external debt was mounting. The economy could not generate enough exports to pay for necessary imports. The Politburo faced a choice: radical reform or national bankruptcy. Gorbachev chose reform. In January 1987, he announced glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. He would attempt to save socialism by introducing elements of market economics and political liberalization. But the timing was disastrous. He was performing major surgery on a patient who was already bleeding out. The reforms unleashed chaos. When price controls were partially lifted, inflation exploded. When enterprises were given autonomy, they hoarded goods rather than selling them. When citizens were allowed to speak freely, they demanded to know why they had been lied to for generations. The carefully balanced system of lies and repression began to unravel. By 1989, the satellite states were breaking away. Poland elected a non-communist government. Hungary opened its border. The Berlin Wall fell. Each departure removed a buffer state that had provided cheap resources and captive markets to the Soviet economy. The empire was contracting and the metropole was too weak to stop it. But the final collapse was not driven by ideology or politics. It was driven by arithmetic. By 1990, the Soviet economy was in freefall. Industrial production declined by over 4%. Consumer goods vanished from stores. The ruble, the official currency, became worthless on international markets. Soviet citizens who had savings watched their purchasing power evaporate. The government faced a stark reality. It owed enormous debts to Western banks, denominated in hard currency. It owed wages to workers, denominated in rubles. It owed subsidies to republics that were now demanding independence. The revenue to pay these obligations simply did not exist. In desperation, the Soviet government began printing money. The printing presses ran day and night, churning out rubles that bought less and less with each passing week. Inflation, which had been suppressed for decades through price controls, roared into the open. By 1991, prices were rising at rates that terrified ordinary citizens. Pensioners saw their life savings become worthless. Workers received wages that could not buy a week's groceries. The institutional pillars of the Soviet state began to crack. Gorbachev attempted a compromise. He proposed a new union treaty that would give the republics greater autonomy while preserving a central government. But on August 19, 1991, hardline communists launched a coup. They detained Gorbachev and declared a state of emergency. The coup failed within 3 days, crushed by popular resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. The failed coup destroyed what little legitimacy remained. If the Communist Party could not even control its own security services, it could not govern. Within weeks, one republic after another declared independence. Ukraine, the second-largest Soviet republic, voted overwhelmingly to leave. Without Ukraine, there was no union to preserve. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a hunting lodge in the Belarusian forest. They signed the Belovezh Accords, which declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. It was not a revolution. It was a liquidation notice served by the remaining shareholders. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved. The economic consequences were devastating. The dissolution left Russia, the successor state, with the bulk of Soviet foreign debt, approximately $70 billion. The Russian government inherited an economy that had contracted by over 15% in a single year. Hyperinflation raged. In 1992, prices increased by over 2,500%. The ruble, which had traded at official rates of less than 1 to the dollar, collapsed to over 1,000 to the dollar on black markets. The transition to capitalism was brutal. State enterprises were privatized through voucher schemes that allowed connected insiders to acquire vast industrial assets for pennies. The oligarchs emerged, a new class of billionaires who had seized the remains of the Soviet economy. Ordinary citizens, promised prosperity through reform, found themselves poorer than they had been under communism. Life expectancy declined catastrophically. In 1990, a Russian man could expect to live to 64. By 1994, that figure had fallen to 57. 7 years of life expectancy vanished in 4 years. Alcoholism, suicide, and cardiovascular disease ravaged a population that had lost its bearings. The former Soviet republics fared little better. Ukraine's economy collapsed by over 60%. Industrial output in the Baltic states fell by half. The ruble zone disintegrated into a chaos of competing currencies. The economic space that had functioned, however badly, as a single unit was shattered into 15 fragments, each struggling to survive. The final accounting of the Soviet collapse reveals an astonishing truth. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which claimed to be the vanguard of human progress, which spent 4 decades competing for global dominance, which maintained a nuclear arsenal capable of ending civilization, was bankrupt for most of its existence. Wealth on paper was an illusion. The ruble was worthless outside Soviet borders. The production statistics were fabricated. The GDP figures measured things nobody wanted to buy. The military power, which seemed so formidable, was purchased at the cost of starving the civilian economy. The empire was not a going concern. It was a Potemkin village the size of a continent. Think about what this means. Every Western analyst who feared Soviet economic competition was measuring a mirage. Every Soviet citizen who believed the propaganda was deceived by their own government. Every Cold War calculation was based on numbers that bore no relationship to reality. The story of the Soviet bankruptcy teaches several lessons that remain relevant today. The first lesson is that information matters more than intention. The The Soviet planners were not stupid. Many were brilliant mathematicians and engineers, but no amount of intelligence can compensate for systematically false data. When you build policy on lies, you build castles in the air. The second lesson is that resource windfalls can be curses. The oil revenues of the 1970s should have been a blessing. Instead, they enabled the Soviet leadership to avoid reform, to maintain unsustainable spending, to pretend that the problems would solve themselves. Easy money became the anesthetic that allowed the patient to ignore the tumor. The third lesson is that military power without economic foundation is a house of cards. The Soviet Union matched American weapons system for system, but it did so by sacrificing the living standards of its citizens. In the end, the population that was asked to make those sacrifices stopped believing the sacrifices were worthwhile. When governments today publish statistics that seem too good to be true, remember the Soviet example. When nations depend on single commodities for their prosperity, remember the oil crash of 1986. When leaders claim that central planning can substitute for market signals, remember Gosplan and its millions of miscalculations. Remember that the most dangerous bankruptcy is the one that nobody admits is happening. The Soviet Union today is a memory and a warning. Its monuments still stand in Moscow, but they commemorate a system that could not survive contact with arithmetic. The empire that claimed to represent the scientific organization of society was destroyed by its inability to count accurately. The ideology that promised abundance delivered scarcity. The superpower that terrorized the West for 4 decades collapsed not from external pressure, but from internal decay. This is the lesson of the Soviet bankruptcy. You can falsify reports. You can manipulate statistics. You can silence critics and imprison economists who tell uncomfortable truths. But you cannot falsify reality forever. Eventually, the ledgers must balance. Eventually, the bills come due. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic Historian channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.